Okay, so this is JavaScript Frameworks. This is week 5, I believe so, week 5. As you guys know, Lab 2 was due last night at midnight, 11:59 p.m., which was the calculator using Express, using Node and Express. Does anyone have any questions about Lab 2 before we get started?
I beat my head against the wall trying to add two numbers together.
Yeah, was it very hard?
Plus y, plus, whatever. Because if you just use a plus sign, it can kind of mix.
Yes. Yeah, if it's a string, which is why I had done parse int. Yeah.
I know, but it's just...
Yeah. But you'll notice that when you use a minus symbol that it doesn't do that because it converts them both into numbers automatically. The loveliness of that is JavaScript. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's definitely good to know. Another thing that you can also do is you can wrap it using the number constructor. So you can just use number, opening bracket, request params x. Yeah, there's tons of different ways that you can do it, which we, as I always say in every class, there's like a million ways to do something, especially in JavaScript. It's just whether or not it's the right way to do something. So, had we actually started this class a week earlier, hopefully I was wanting to assign Lab 3, but because of also having Thanksgiving at the same time, the week before reading week, today I'm actually going to be assigning assignment 1. So for assignment 1, it is a portfolio site. So in past classes, this is a really good assignment to do. Let me just change this, JavaScript Frameworks. And this is COMP2068. So what this is it's the ability to create like a portfolio site for yourself. What's pretty common on most portfolio sites is you'll put up, past work that you've done, an ability to contact that person, some sort of homepage that gets you like interested in like, oh wow, this is a pretty cool website. And sometimes services or just even about that person. So an example that I did last semester, this was actually the website that I built for my former employer actually just before leaving. So as I said, like every website that you go to, especially when you're trying to sell either yourself or yourself as in the company, you always have to try to be like as interesting as possible. So what is pretty common is moving videos as a background with some sort of like text over it, maybe a call to action. And again, your website probably is not going to be this crazy already. I'm not going to expect you to create a YouTube video or something to display on your site. However, I'm just kind of giving you like a very high level. I have some other examples as well of what a portfolio site could be. So as you scroll down, in this case, we have the specialties of the site, which is interactive experiences, emerging technology, and digital engineering. Further down, they have some of the latest developments that they've done, which is in a carousel, brands that they've worked with in the past, and then at the bottom is a need a quote, contact information. So where they're located and a little form that you can fill out, and then a footer. So again, as I said, not expecting you guys to create this crazy website, but this is just a small example of something that you could end up creating. This is not using Bootstrap, no. So under work, we have some past stuff that we've done. Of course, this is your final of your second year for most of you. So either you're going to be graduating at the end of this semester or going into your third year, but you should have a fair amount of work that you've done in the past. I don't necessarily mean professionally, but at least some assignments that you guys might be proud of that you want to display to potentially a future employer or a future co-op. Something that you feel kind of like sets you apart. That's kind of what we're going for here. So you can go through, in this case, every single one of these is an article that you can click into. Again, not a requirement, just an example of what's being done. Then the About Us section, which I am still on their site for some reason as a current employee, even though I'm not. But they have their vision, mission, the team, and latest coverage. And again, there's always the quote at the bottom. some press stuff for when they're mentioned in the news, and then lastly, the get a quote, which just brings you to the bottom because it's on every page. So again, not expecting you to go full out on this. Sounds bad to say, but not full out in the fact that I'm not expecting you to work full time to get this assignment done. Really what the goal of this is that you are able to create a portfolio that, again, you can give to a potential co-op or a future company that you might want to work for, and be able to show them that, one, that you're competent in the node stack that we're using in class, but also, like I said, I have a bunch of students that have done the bare minimum, and if you gave me their website, I would not hire them, even though that I had to mark them in class. But that being said, I mean, if I open up some of these other ones, let's see. So here's a little more one. For those of you that know Jess, she's a part-time teacher here at the college. But in fact, this was created, I believe, when she was a student. So if you go under, unless she's updated it. So if you go to about, similar kind of thing, you have the 3-column service or about that person, checking out past work, some testimonials, and then a connect, being able to put in your information, and then click send. So for this, it is not going to be a single page. I know some people in the past like to do single pages, but the reason that we're going to be doing not a single page is just being able to see that you understand how to use Express with its routing. So that way we can have multiple pages, we can have some multiple templates and our views going on, being able to do some partial stuff like that, that you don't really get the benefit of doing inside of a single page. So I'll go over the requirements. Let me zoom this a little bit. Okay. I'm actually going to remove this. Okay. So, as I said, we're creating a portfolio site. So we're going to be using Express.js and implementing our knowledge of Pug, which is the templating engine that we've been using. And your site must be hosted live on a cloud service, such as Heroku or DigitalOcean. I always recommend in this class, please use Heroku. It is the easiest, fastest way to get your project up on the cloud. Otherwise, you have to do some configuration, and I will repeat, will not accept an IP address as your cloud hosting, which I have also done in the past. The reason for this is, like I said, Heroku, the reason why last week, actually, when we were trying to deploy to the cloud, that it would not work is because we were not putting in an environment variable for a port, which I'll go over when we do some cloud hosting later today. But what this does is it allows us to pretty much, I put in quotes, infinitely scale our applications. Reason being is you can create multiple instances of your website, and it can be running on different ports on Heroku, but externally it's all running on the same port. So it uses a technology called Docker, most likely, or some sort of containerized way of hosting your application, where it's not always going to be running on port 3000, which is why it wasn't working for us. The instructions for the site is, it's an Express site, so it must include the pages from your personal portfolio. We're going to have a home page, an About Me page, projects page, a services page, and a contact me page. So these are just 5 pages. Again, that way we can just kind of get more familiar using Pug and using Express Router. Your portfolio site will be using Express and Node as your web pages, have been split to use different view templates and partials by implementing the Pug templating engine and Express routes. You will need to include a minimum of 1 view template, and an Express route must exist for each page of your site. So you'll need to use the app.get method structure with a res.render to render each view. So this is what we've been doing in class. We did it last week and the week before that, where we're able to render a .pug file that is in our views folder inside of a router that we've created inside of our routes folder. You don't have to create a different route file for each route. Everything just being inside of a index.js file is totally valid, but this is more just, again, to get comfortable with having multiple routes inside of one file. Your site will use the new structure created by the Express generator. Your site files will be migrated to work within the public, routes, and views folders. So what this just means is that you have used the Express generator to scaffold out our application like we did last week. Again, it's a good way of just getting your project started, so that way you don't have to worry about creating all these files and folders and making sure that everything's working, which is kind of the reason, again, why last week when I tried to put our calculator onto Heroku, it wasn't working, and it's just because I had forgotten to put in something. Whereas using the Express generator, we'll do that by default. So generate your site structure with the Express generator. Note you must use the -e option to ensure that you implement the pug templating. That's not right. _view equals pug, and I'll just throw that onto a new line just so it is easier. _view equals pug, and your JavaScript, CSS, and multimedia asset files should be moved to separate folders within the public folder. I'm not necessarily, like I said, I'm not expecting you to put up a whole bunch of multimedia, but if you're wanting to use maybe some images or screenshots of your application, you'll store it under the public folder, under most likely the images folder that's there, as well as any sort of custom CSS or JavaScript that you want to put onto the front end. But if you're wanting to use something like Bootstrap with jQuery, you're just as easily able to use the CDN providers, so that way you don't have to put it inside of your application. As mentioned here, using Twitter Bootstrap CSS framework or a third-party theme is strongly recommended, but you don't have to do it. For this assignment especially, I'm not really marking your artistic ability at creating a nice, pretty website. But what is nice is that Twitter Bootstrap comes with their grid system, so that way you can create a website that looks good both on mobile and on desktop. So that way you don't have to go through the aggravation of making sure that it loads correctly on a phone or a tablet or a desktop. Because like I said, this is supposed to be shared. You're supposed to share this with other people. If that's not your intention, I mean, feel free to build it yourself if you're more a front-end person, but like I said, it's not a requirement. You will define routes for all your site pages in the index.js file in your routes folder. Your views folder will contain your pug page templates. You will create a separate folder named partials for all your partial pug files, and you need at least 2 partials. So we're going to create a header.pug and a footer.pug, which we showed last week on how to include it, but we will go over it again today. And this is just so that way we can take some of the logic that would be in our layout file and just put it into a separate file to easily manage our template. All of your code, so any of your HTML, your CSS, your JavaScript, any custom jQuery, etc., must be error-free. So obviously, if you want me to use your site, there better not be errors, otherwise I'm probably not going to have a good experience on it. Your site also uses appropriate JavaScript libraries that function through the use of links to various CDNs. So if you're using, like I said, Bootstrap and jQuery, just use the CDN just because it is a lot easier, and you don't have to host those files yourself. The latest version of your site will be hosted live and error-free on a cloud hosting service. Again, this is a requirement, and as recommended, please use Heroku because it is, like I said, it's very easy. Internal documentation, so this is where we start getting into comments inside of our project. Ensure that you include a comment header for your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files that indicates the file name, author's name, website name, and file description. Ensure that you include section headers on your HTML structure, CSS style sections, or any JavaScript. Ensure all your code uses contextual variable names. So this is not necessarily comments, but this is the way that we write our code. So using good contextual variable names that helps make stuff more human readable. And then lastly, ensure that you include inline comments that describe your GUI design and functionality. but please avoid over commenting. So just to go over that, that was a lot very quickly just for the commenting stuff. But in every file that we work on, it's usually a good idea to explain, if not by the file name, kind of what that file is used for. So in the case of a project that I'm working on, which is in WordPress, it's very common to have a file called functions.php, which maybe doesn't describe a whole lot. It just says functions, which you might not necessarily have context to what that is. So what it is good to do is provide comments of context to either that file in specific, or maybe a comment as a section header for what a route is going to do. Lastly, really, I don't want comments where you declare a variable that's called time and then you put a comment beside it that says this is the time, because the variable name itself is kind of displaying what that is. So over commenting is usually not a good thing to do. Really, and this is kind of part of using the headers at the top, comments are a really good way to catch plagiarism, which is not necessarily a good reason to ever do something, but I have caught many students plagiarizing just because they forgot to change headers. Yes?
So you want to block at the top?
Yeah, just something kind of basic. If I were to open up my...
Comment header, if I understand.
Yeah, let me just open up my editor and give you a quick example. So, zoom this in. I think I zoomed it in. Yep, okay. So let me make it JavaScript. So we have a JavaScript file, and I'm just going to create a block comment that just says file name, example.js, file author, Chris Naismith, description, this file serves as an example of creating a comment header block. So that's pretty much it. You just throw it up at the top. The other thing is when we work on code, and really at the college we don't necessarily have as much of this because we are constantly creating new stuff and not really going back to old stuff. But when you're working on files out in the real world, you might be working on something that you haven't seen either ever before, or you might be working on something that you started working on like 5-6 months ago. So comments are a good way of being able to explain something to ourselves that at the point when we're working on it and when we write our code, we have context to why we're doing something. But 6 months down the line, you might not necessarily know, why am I looping over this variable? Or why am I assigning it, I equals I plus 1? Why am I adding 1 to I? So there's a lot that goes on, and quite honestly, I'm guilty of it as well, of not commenting my code sometimes. But it is definitely something that I would say separates probably that intermediate senior level developer. Is you might have someone that might be very good at writing code, but they're only good at writing code at that time. Whereas the main thing that a senior developer should be doing is making sure that code is maintainable for the future. Like I said, that kind of like 6 months, 12 months down the road, you come back to something that you haven't seen before, or you haven't seen in a while, and just having that context. The last thing, which is again a requirement for every class, but I threw it in here, is that you must share your files on GitHub to demonstrate version control. This is a little bit different than the past 2 labs that we've done, in the fact that there is a requirement of at least a minimum amount of 4 commits. The reason for this is when we're working on code, you should always, whenever you're working on one section, when you're done it, or maybe a part of it, you stop, do a git commit, and then you don't have to necessarily push up. You can stack up several git commits and then push up, maybe 3, 4, 11, doesn't matter. But the reason that we're doing this is trying to get some good git practices. What I really recommend you not to do is to make a bunch of file changes and then just upload your files to Git. I encourage you to use either the Git CLI or some sort of Git GUI, so that way, can I actually open up your GitHub repository that you had shown me earlier? Is that okay? No? Okay. No, it's not. But what happens is when you upload files through GitHub, it typically will do an upload comment of saying files added through upload. So you don't get those git commit messages that will tell you why something was uploaded. So an example, let me go to mine. I'll go to last week's, we'll do this one, week 4. So I only have 2 GitHub commits. The first one you can see is just an init, and then I created a second commit that said creation of nav middleware for is logged in. So I can go in and just see this. It's just a comment, or like the git commit message is saying, all right, he used this is logged in, and then we included our nav, and we're using is logged in here. So using Git properly is a good way of, again, collaboration when we start working on some group projects, being able to share with your teammates what's going on, but also at the end of the day, like, it's a good thing for me as I'm looking at your code. I want to know what you're working on, what got done when, and if you commit everything all at once and just do a commit message saying done, it doesn't give me any context to how the application was developing. So as I just said, there is a minimum requirement of 4 GitHub commits, which is actually mentioned, I believe, at the top up here. Yeah, right here. But again, like, this is just so that way you guys can kind of get comfortable with using Git. I know sometimes some of the other classes in this program doesn't necessarily use Git as much. Did anyone here have to use SFTP in any of the classes for uploading code, updating code? Yeah? Okay. Not a good way to do it because typically, again, if you're working with multiple developers, I might upload my code over SFTP and overwrite your stuff, or you'll overwrite my stuff, which is why we use stuff like version control of being able to manage that. So this assignment is done in 2 parts. So assignment 1, part 1, is due this Sunday. So you have, again, a week to work on it, and the requirements for it is just this up at the top. You're going to create a private GitHub repository. You're going to create your site using like Express Generator and have a minimum of 4 GitHub commits. That's really it. It's fairly basic. The reason that this is a requirement is some students will wait until the last second to work on their project and then realize, wow, there's a lot that I have to do for this, at least the night before. So this is at least a good way of being able to have part of your assignment started, so that way when it is the night before the entire thing is due, you're not cramming, starting at 11 o'clock and handing it in at 2:30 and losing part marks.
So how much has to be done for this? Like, from your description here, from all the text you've shown us, at what point do you have to finish on the instructions to get?
So again, there's not a requirement of the amount of content that you do, but kind of as a good example would be if I was doing 4 GitHub commits. So obviously you have to create a repo so that you can hand it in. So that's, but for the first one that I would do is I use Express Generator and then save. So that's 1 commit. Second one is maybe I create my views files. So I create the, right here, I'm going to create a index.pug, about me pug, projects pug, services pug, and contact me pug. And just make sure that all of those are extending from the layout. So you've kind of done the basic stuff. So now that's 1 save. Now you do the exact same thing, but in your route file, you now link to those files. So you have router.use, index, use the index.pug file, about me, use about me.pug, projects, use projects, etc., etc. So now you've set up your basic stuff. So that's 3 commits. Now the 4th one, what I would probably do is get Bootstrap on the site in your layout and using the partials, get those out of the way, and then also set up your navbar. That's pretty much it. And then that way you have a full week to do the content for the rest of your site. I could probably do this in about half an hour, probably less.
Is Bootstrap syntactically different on pug files than it is in, say, regular HTML?
The only thing is just using like the different syntax. Where
So syntax is different using
well, you're
bootstrap and
just
Mongoose?
it's no different than the rest of the HTML that we do. So when you're doing a div, so I'll just do this in another. No, it's fine. I'm just going to quickly show it. So instead of doing HTML like this, you just use HTML. If you want a div with a class name of example, you can either do div.example or you can actually just do .example.
Okay, but then when you're identifying in the classes the bootstrap stuff like 12 column.
Yeah, so you would just do .row, .column 12, .column medium 4.
Yeah, okay. So there's no quotations. That's really what's kind of the different thing.
Kind of, yeah. It uses the dot syntax. It's very similar to
To a class.
exactly like doing classes in CSS. If you ever get lost, and this is for everyone in class, if you ever get lost of trying to figure out how your HTML should look in Pug, as I've shown before in class, there's an HTML to Jade / Pug. Exactly. So you could just do an example of saying, I'm going to do a new paragraph tag that's saying, this is an example of writing HTML and outputting Jade. And maybe I want to give it a class of example. Yeah. So if you ever get stuck, you can just use HTML to do it. Again, I just always prefer to just use Pug.
I know.
I'll say this. For myself, I have a lot of experience with Pug. You guys are just starting out, so I'm not expecting you guys to be masters. And really, I mean, every class that you guys are working on is something different. I'm sure that it would be really refreshing if, they taught the exact same stuff from start to finish. But you're going to have a lot of people graduating here that some will go off doing PHP, some will do C#, some will continue to talk at the back of my class, guys. Guys, thank you. So honestly, there's going to be a lot of different stuff that you'll graduate doing in this class. And while, again, Pug might not be your favorite, it is just introducing you to something else that's out there. So that way, if you ever go to a new employer, you'll be like, oh, this kind of looks familiar to me. I think I did this, a couple years ago. So that's mostly it. Let's see, there was something else that I was wanting to mention. So yeah, just the 4 GitHub commits, creating your private repository. The other thing that I would maybe recommend doing is at the beginning setting up Heroku. The reason for this is when you set up your cloud hosting at the beginning and you do the automatic deployments, as long as you're pushing up error-free code that it's just going to automatically work. Whereas waiting until the last second to do a cloud deployment, maybe you've done some sort of error and now it's preventing it from working. And now you go, well, now my entire application isn't working. Whereas if you're just doing, if you do it at the very beginning when you know that it's going to be working, then as you write code and push it up, you'll be like, oh, now the cloud hosted isn't working. Why isn't that working? So you can kind of diagnose from what happened from the previous commit to the current commit to try to figure out that error without having to harass me at right when this thing is due. So let's see. So yeah, so just like any other lab that we've done in this class and everything in the future, all you need to do is submit the cloud link so that way I can access it, and then a link to your GitHub repository. Same thing with lab 2. Please make this a private GitHub repository and add me as a contributor to it so that way your other classmates aren't able to copy your code because as you guys probably know by now, if there's 2 people that have exactly identical code, there's no way of me knowing either who wrote the code, even though GitHub has timestamps, but you might have written the code and then shared it, and you're kind of still a part of that plagiarism process. So we're kind of responsible for ourselves. Did you have a question?
It says 20%. Your other page says 25.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. And that also says 20% there. Apparently I'm not very good at doing this. but it says it right here. Okay, so external code. This is obviously a big one because we as developers don't like to write stuff more than once. Kind of the best thing to recommend is that your code shouldn't be more than 10% of someone else's code. By this I mean if you take code online that's maybe the example that I did was a random number generator where I generated between, say 1 and 100. I'm not going to write that over and over again. I'm just going to take that from online. But if we're taking all of our code online, especially in a classroom setting, we're not learning anything. We're just taking other people. At this point, we'd just be doing puzzle pieces and just putting other people's code and making sure that it all works. And we're like, all right, cool, I'm done. The point of this is not to always get it done as fast as possible, but is to learn as much as possible from this. And then, of course, the last thing is that, again, this is an individual assignment. This is not a group assignment. That means that you are working as one person, not sharing your code. It's your own work. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about assignment 1? Yes?
Is that 25% due for this Sunday or it's kind of half?
No, it's actually a smaller portion. So for this, the maximum marks on this assignment is 40. So part 1 is just 4. Unless if you do more. But basically, 10% is part 1, and then the rest of it is due for part 2, just because there isn't a huge requirement for part 1. Again, this actually just always used to just be a full, there wasn't a part 1 and part 2, it was just a full assignment 1. And just like I said, there were students that were waiting until the last minute and then losing a lot of marks, so at least you can get some easy marks right off at the beginning. So part 1 is 4 of the 40, and then part 2 is the 36 of 40. Does that make sense? Okay. Does anyone else have any?
And the last part, if you got to the end of your page, you had the bonus stuff, right?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I did not cover the bonus.
Right. So the React.js is a different framework
Yes.
than Pug.
Yeah.
So why would you include that if you want to use Pug?
So this is, again, optional. But I've had students that have come in here that already have a lot of experience using like React and stuff. And they're like, oh, I'd rather do it in React. So, all right, I made it as a bonus. You don't have to do Pug, but all of those things that we do in Pug, like the partials and the importing and extending, we all do in React. So it's just another way that someone can do it if they choose to and get some bonus marks in the process. Some other optional site features for bonus marks is creating a working contact form on the Contact Me page. So in order to do this, what most people use is the Node mailer package that's on NPM. Again, you're not having to write this from scratch. There is a module that's able to do it. The one thing that I do encourage you, just because I do have some students that don't make a private repository, is if you are going to be doing the contact form, please 100% use a private repository, because most likely you're going to be putting email credentials into your GitHub. Not always a good way to do it, but we're not going to cover as much with environment variables. But basically, if you push up your username and password to an email into the cloud, or onto GitHub, there are bots that are constantly scanning GitHub repositories, looking for username and passwords to being able to use them to, send spam, sometimes to like log into other online services, stuff like that. So if you're going to do the contact form and put your details in there, make sure that your GitHub repository is private so that way someone can't see it. The other thing is an external document. This one's usually more, I find, with the design students. But if you want to create like pretty much like a style guide or a brand document that kind of outlines like colors, stuff like that, you're welcome to do so if you're more design oriented. And then lastly, which is just 2 bonus marks, is you have the ability to attach a full domain name to your site. You get one for free through the GitHub student package. So if you haven't used it, you get 1 year for free with, I believe it's a .me domain. Otherwise, I don't necessarily I'm not encouraging you to buy a domain to get an extra 2 marks on this assignment, but if you have one laying around or you want to use it through the GitHub student package, good thing to do, because typically we don't want to give someone a site that's, you know, whatever.heroku.com. We want to be able to give them, like, for example, you know, smashreality.com, tigershark.com, that sort of kind of stuff. We want to give them a nice domain. So yeah, thank you for bringing up the bonus marks. I had scrolled right past it. Anyone have any more questions for assignment 1? Okay. So it's 6:40. What we're going to do is we're going to be going over CRUD using Mongo today. So I guess, quick question, does anyone here know what MongoDB is? Correct. So it's not a database that has, in the case, tables. Anyone else know what MongoDB is? Kinda. So,
Just DB stands for database, that's it.
yeah, it's a Mongo database. Yeah. What more do you need? Yeah. So actually, it is in JSON. So MongoDB, previously the databases that you guys most likely have used are SQL databases. So MySQL, MS SQL, SQLite, all of these different things are all SQL, which means that it's the standard query language. It has a similar interface for being able to query no matter what type of database that you're using. Whereas Mongo uses what is called NoSQL, which is just the opposite. It's not SQL. But most SQL databases that you've used, or sorry, probably all SQL databases that you've used, use what are called tables. So tables have rows, and rows are your different pieces of information. So for example, if you were to create a users table, you might have a first name, a last name, maybe an email address, password, some sort of thing like that, and you would have your different columns. You can kind of think of like a spreadsheet. However, NoSQL does not have this. So why does this matter? So if I actually go to MongoDB, just loading. So what MongoDB is really good for is for scaling and having very fast writes and reads with large amounts of data. The reason for this is a traditional database, when you're trying to optimize your data, you end up putting indexes into your database. So you can think of it almost like a cache of being able to say, if I'm looking up by this ID, have it organized in a way that I can easily find this information. So that's typically, you know, like a primary key. So when you have a user, you would have user 1, user 2, user 3, etc., and etc. However, when we're going into more dynamic kind of data, because in the real world, nothing always fits into a nice box. You'll see in your databases, sometimes we'll have null fields, empty strings, stuff like that. Where Mongo is very strong is there is no